Our lecture today covers Italy during the 15th century, and this time period is also known as the Middle Renaissance. During our last lecture, we covered Italy during the 1300s, and we were mostly stationed around the city of Padua. Today, we're going to be covering the city of Florence. During the 15th century, the city of Florence was really the place to be. It would have been similar to what Paris would have been like in the late 19th century, or what New York would have been like in the early 20th century. If it was happening, it was happening there. But we still have some problems, though. We have attacks on Florence from their neighboring city-states of Milan and Naples. The plague visits again in 1417, and we see 16,000 Florentines perish. Now, the plague, not only was it bad for the city of Florence, but it also helped them, because when Milan was attacking, the Duke of Milan was killed by the plague and his army retreated. We also have taxes that become an issue in 1420, and I'll show you an artwork later in the presentation that really talks directly about taxation. Halley's Comet passes the Earth in 1453, causing widespread panic because it's associated with horrific earthquakes that are happening during this time. And they were so bad, Florentines were sleeping outside at night. We also have the city of Constantinople falling in the same year of 1453. But not everything is bad. There's also some good news. In 1454, the Medici family rise to power, and they're able to provide a relative calm to the city until they are exiled in 1494. So we have about 40 years of some pretty stable societal life. And fortunately for us, the Medici were tremendous patrons of the arts. We're going to start this lecture by looking at the Florence Cathedral. And as far as the cathedral complex is concerned, there's three elements that we see. We first start to see the bell tower, which is over here. We have the cathedral itself. And then up front, we have the baptistery. And you may be familiar with the bell tower of the cathedral complex at Pisa, because that is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but that's really the only element of that cathedral complex we see. The Florence Cathedral, though, is a really remarkable structure. The cathedral and baptistery itself was built way back during the Dark Ages, about 1296, and Giotto, who we talked about from the previous chapter, was the one who designed the bell tower. We'll first look at the baptistery, and there was a set of doors into the baptistery that was commissioned. There was a contest held, and the winner would be given the commission to create the set of north doors, and the north doors were going to be made from bronze. Anytime you see bronze mentioned as an artwork during this time period, you have to associate that with money. For instance, if you were creating two sculptures the same size, one out of marble and one out of bronze, the one out of bronze is about 10 times as expensive to make. This project for the doors would be funded by the Wool Merchants Guild, and we had talked about guilds also during the last lecture. Giovanni de' Medici, he's one of the judges. And there's also a link to a video put out by PBS about Medici Godfathers of the Renaissance. And part one, you actually get to see Giovanni de' Medici and how influential he was in both the city of Florence as well as the arts. So the contest came down to really about two individuals. We have Lorenzo Ghiberti, who provides us with this artwork here. And we also have Filippo Brunelleschi, who completes this artwork. The shape of these artworks are defined as a quatrefoil, and the subject matter for these two works is the sacrifice of Isaac. So we'll bring them up together here. And you really kind of want to take a look at them and really see how different it is. We have the work at the left by Ghiberti, which may be defined as suave and graceful. Both artists were about 23 years old during this contest. And of course, during the sacrifice of Isaac, you have Abraham being told by God to take his only son out to the woods and sacrifice him. But just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, an angel appears and telling Abraham it was just a test of his faith. But each work had to have, of course, Abraham, Isaac, the angel, a forest scene, and also two assistants and a donkey. So you've got these two images, same figures in each, but they're arranged much differently. The image at the right is much more rugged and explosive, and you can kind of see the angel really has to hold back Abraham's hand before he sacrifices his son. Now, the winner of this contest is Ghiberti, and Ghiberti gets the privilege of creating the north doors, and it's going to take him roughly 23 years to complete this project. Now, after he completes this project, the baptistry loves these doors so much they commission him directly to create the east doors, which he spends the next 27 years working on. The reason that Ghiberti got the commission in the first place was because when we look at the work at the left is created all from one piece of bronze, where the work at the right is completed by several pieces and then welded back up to the back plate. And so a lot more bronze was used in this work. Since bronze is so expensive, it really proved that Ghiberti was the better metal worker of the two. Brunelleschi instead now goes to Rome, where he spends the next few years really studying the architecture of the ancient Roman Empire. And he comes back to Florence, and he's hired by the Medici family to build the dome on top of the Florence Cathedral. And during the 1400s, if you had been alive during that time, you would have had this huge cathedral complex, but no covering over the altar, the most holy place of the church. And this was really an embarrassment to the entire city. Previous to this large open space that the dome was going to cover, the largest uninterrupted space in the Western world was the Pantheon, and it's like 138 feet in diameter. And the problem is, this is made out of concrete, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, we had lost really the recipe to create concrete. So we had to find a way to support this dome during its construction. There wasn't enough timber in the adjacent areas to provide scaffolding. There was even ideas of literally putting dirt into this cathedral so that that would serve as the basis to build upon. And then in the several layers of dirt, gold coins would be thrown in so that when it came time to remove the dirt, you would have a willing and able workforce wanting to find those gold coins by removing the dirt inside the cathedral. But fortunately, neither of those were needed. What ends up happening with the cathedral's dome is that Brunelleschi devises a way to make two domes, an outer covering, which we see here, and then an inner smaller dome, which you see here in the left-hand image, which is on the inside painted during the 1600s. In between the two spaces is vacant space. It's basically a stairway up to the cupola, which we see in the image at the right. And again, this was created later. It wasn't created during Brunelleschi's time. The Florence Cathedral is accessible for visitors. You can go up to the cupola 6 days a week. It costs you about €8. There's a tremendous amount of steps, but the view is definitely incredibly inspiring. Brunelleschi's ashes were found in the crypt of the Florence Cathedral in the 1970s, around 1978, and reburied. And there you have a sculpture of him at the left and his grave at the right. But Brunelleschi really provided much more than the dome for the Florence Cathedral. Remember, this is the person who lost against Ghiberti for the commission for those bronze doors, but really I think he's more famous today for all his other accomplishments. As I said, besides the dome, he created the Hospital of the Innocents, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, which is not a hospital the way we know hospitals are today for the sick and the injured. This is an orphanage, and you would be raised here to the age of 18 and even given vocational training. There's a lot of people in Italy today with the last name of Innocenti, which can trace their roots back to this hospital, this orphanage. Now, this building is also really unique because no other building had been built like this since ancient Roman times. Remember that Brunelleschi, after he lost the commission for the doors, went to Rome and really studied the mathematics that were used to create these ancient Roman structures, and he came back and he created this incredible building. The infant medallions, which this building is noted for, this is a later addition to the building by Andrea della Robbia, and these were symbols of the innocent children massacred by King Herod. But when we look at the building structure, we have these Corinthian columns along the arcade. A lot of the spaces are defined by the Pythagorean theorem. When you look at the windows along the front of the building, you'll see that they have pediments. We have an inner courtyard, which you see here. And this is really the first time in 1,000 years that we have a Roman structure being built here. And people would gather at the site, literally in the way of the workers, because no one had seen a building constructed like this before. The fun fact about this structure is this is the first building ever built with a blueprint. And the reason that a blueprint had to be used here was because Brunelleschi was across town literally building the dome on the Florence Cathedral. So he was doing this project at the same time. Another building that we're interested in the city of Florence, in fact it's in the oldest area of Florence, is the ORSANMICHELE. And the streets are so tiny here that you can never get a really good picture of this building. This, of course, was way before the idea of using cars and such. And the building has been used as a granary, as a convent. Today it's a museum. And what we're excited about are these niches on the outside of the structure. There's approximately 13 or 14 niches, and each one is dedicated to a patron saint of the larger guilds of Florence. The guilds in turn commissioned the famous artists to fill the niches, and we have some of the best sculptural development here of the 15th century. We have people like Lorenzo Ghiberti, who create the largest bronze sculpture during this time, approximately 8 feet tall. And with St. John the Baptist, the guild commissioning this, even though Ghiberti was the best metal worker, they didn't believe that he could create a sculpture this large. And even in the contract between the guild and the artist, said that if he couldn't complete this sculpture, they did not owe him any money. We also have St. George by Donatello, and a lot of these figures are elongated. The idea is that we're looking up at these figures. The niches start about 6 feet in terms of height, so we're looking up at them. So in this case, we see kind of the shield is a little awkward in terms of size, and it would distort our optical illusion of sight when we look up at it. We have St. Luke the Evangelist by Giambologna. And one of my favorites is Four Crowned Martyrs by Nani da Banco. And here we have 4 figures in this niche, all very much in Roman garb. When we look at the Augustus of Primaporta here, we can see that they're dressed very, very similarly. These were 4 stonecutters or sculptors that were martyred because they refused to make an image of a pagan god. Doubting Thomas by Verrocchio, and we'll cover Verrocchio in the next lecture because Verrocchio runs this workshop where he has a young apprentice by the name of Leonardo da Vinci. But with Doubting Thomas here, it's also a unique sculpture because we have 2 figures. We have Christ in the niche itself, and then we have the Apostle Thomas on our side reaching in to feel the wound of Christ. Now, these sculptures were removed from the niches during World War II to protect them, and we found out that the cast of Christ was hollow. It did not even have a back to the sculpture. It was just the figure's front half. And this is the ground floor of the ORSANMICHELE, where it has a beautiful altarpiece around 10 to 12 feet tall. And we had mentioned last week that some of these altarpieces are in situ in their original location, and that is the case with this work here. The ORSANMICHELE's outside today has replica sculptures. The original ones are inside the museum. And I want to end this part of the lecture by talking about Donatello's David. Donatello is a very unique figure in terms of art. Normally, during this time, your life cycle might be 40 years. However, Donatello lived until he was 80, about twice the average length of time a normal person would live. So he was able to produce a tremendous amount of work. He had a very bad temper, and he would be known to smash his creations. His creations were so lifelike even that he was caught yelling at one of his sculptures called Zucconi or Zucchini Head, and he would be yelling at it, quote, "Speak, damn you, speak." But Donatello's David is a really important sculpture. It's probably the most important sculpture from the 15th century, where we have this young boy about the age of 12 or 13 that has just slayed Goliath. It's the first time in literally 1,000 years that we have a full-sized male nude sculpture in the round, and basically since the Roman Empire. So this makes this sculpture very, very unique and very important. Previous to the Greek classical age, sculpture was very strict, very solid. It didn't look extremely lifelike. In fact, when we look at MENKAURE and his wife over here, they're very geometric in terms of form, and we do have the illusion of motion with them having one foot stepped in front of the other. But by about 300 BC, when we reach the classical age of Greece, we have a term called contrapposto, which just means counterbalance or weight shift, where we have the hips and legs in a really different position than the shoulders and the head. And we've got the sculpture of Hermes and Dionysus at the right, and we can see how the stance is much more natural. So we say that it has contrapposto. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the contrapposto stance that you see disappears, and really it's Donatello, and he's followed by Michelangelo in the next century for bringing this pose back. And we have this direct relationship with Renaissance art to the Greek and Roman era because of these techniques. The statue of David is also very different than the one we're normally used to seeing by Michelangelo. We have a younger boy, has very effeminate features. In this case, he wears a bonnet, long flowing hair. But even though we don't think that perhaps this David would stand a chance against Goliath, we can see that the battle's already over and David hasn't even broken a sweat. We have a severed head of Goliath that he's literally toying with underneath his foot. We also have a feather that emerges from Goliath's helmet that caresses the inside of the sculpture's leg. And this was something that would have been very dangerous and not publicly accepted during the 15th century because it was this homoerotic element. Now, Donatello could very well have been a homosexual. We have documentation to support that. But the idea of this sculpture as well is that it is a private sculpture made for the Medici family. This would have not have been put on public display anywhere in Florence. It would have perhaps led to Donatello's arrest and imprisonment. But having it in a private family's courtyard where we really didn't even know this sculpture exists. In fact, we're really unsure of the date when the sculpture was first created. It's about a 20 to 25 year span of time where we think Donatello could have created this sculpture. But again, it's bronze, so it's very, very expensive. And of course, it is for the courtyard of the Medici family. We really know it exists once we start to see it on inventory lists in the 1460s. And keep in mind, we'll take another look at these two sculptures in the next lecture, how different the sculpture of Donatello's is compared to Michelangelo's. And it really doesn't end here. It continues on in the Baroque era when we get there to the artist Bernini, has definitely a much different look for the statue of David. And Donatello also completed this sculpture of David really early in the 1400s. I want to say approximately 1408 is when he completed this one of his earliest sculptures. So we're going to stop this part of the lecture here. When we continue on, we're going to talk about Brunelleschi again and the importance of linear perspective.